When you are 20 years old and looking to buy your first sports car, desperation can often cloud your judgment. Anthony had been saving up from his warehouse job for 2 years, desperate to upgrade his grandfather's rusty old Buick. He wanted a Mustang. After weeks of scouring Craigslist, he found a listing that seemed like a miracle. A 2013 blue Mustang GT, manual transmission, with only 32,000 miles. The asking price was a shockingly low $16,000. The ad had only been posted 4 minutes prior. Fearing he would miss out, Anthony called the number immediately. A friendly, normal-sounding older man answered, chuckling about how fast Anthony had found the ad. They agreed to meet at the seller's house at 6 p.m. Anthony drove for over an hour, leaving the familiar suburbs behind. The GPS led him deep into a rural, heavily wooded, and visibly impoverished area. The road turned from asphalt to dirt. Finally, the GPS announced he had arrived. The house sitting at the end of the long driveway was a decaying, isolated structure with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. There was no blue Mustang parked outside. There was no garage visible from the front. Anthony parked his Buick but left the engine running. He sat there for 5 minutes, a deep sense of unease settling in his stomach. Just as he was about to put the car in reverse and leave, the front door of the house creaked open. A man in his 50s stepped out onto the porch, waving and smiling warmly. Reluctantly, Anthony turned off the engine and got out. "Where's the car?" Anthony asked, keeping his distance. "It's in the basement garage around back," the man said, gesturing for Anthony to follow him inside the house. "Come on through, it's easier." Against his better judgment, Anthony stepped inside. The house smelled strongly of mildew and rot. It was completely unfurnished, no pictures on the walls, no rugs, no signs of life. The man led Anthony down a dark, narrow hallway toward a closed door that supposedly led to the basement stairs. As they walked, Anthony heard the heavy floorboards creaking loudly from the second floor above them. Creak, creak, creak. Someone else was up there, pacing. Then Anthony heard the muffled sound of metal clinking coming from behind the basement door. Without Anthony asking, the man quickly offered an explanation. "That's just my wife upstairs," he said smoothly, "and my buddy is down in the garage tuning up the engine." The unprompted explanation sent a massive red flag through Anthony's mind. The man grabbed the handle of the basement door and swung it open, turning on a dim overhead light. Anthony peered down the wooden stairs. At the bottom was a large concrete room. It wasn't a garage. There were no garage doors. It was a solid concrete bunker, and it was completely empty. Anthony stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the man whose friendly smile had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, dead stare. Anthony didn't say a word. He spun around to run back down the hallway, but the path to the front door was now blocked. A second, massive man had silently come down from the upstairs floor and was standing in the hallway, holding a long, rusted metal tool, like a heavy crowbar or a pipe. Panic exploded in Anthony's chest. He yelled that they could have his wallet and shoved past the older man, fleeing blindly down the opposite end of the hallway. He crashed through a flimsy wooden back door, spilling out into the overgrown backyard. He sprinted around the perimeter of the house, practically throwing himself into the driver's seat of his Buick. He locked the doors, jammed the key into the ignition, and floored the gas. As he sped down the dirt driveway, he looked in his rearview mirror. Both men were standing perfectly still on the front porch, watching him leave. Anthony called 911 from the highway. When police raided the property an hour later, the men were gone. The house had been abandoned and in foreclosure for over 4 years. But the terror wasn't over. At 2 a.m. that night, Anthony received a text from an unknown number. The message simply read, "Look outside your window." He called the police immediately. They found the older man from the house hiding in the bushes directly beneath Anthony's bedroom window. He was arrested, and Anthony learned a terrifying lesson about deals that are too good to be true. Finding off-the-book summer jobs as a teenager can be difficult. In the summer of 2012, a 15-year-old girl named Jessica was desperate for cash. She scoured Craigslist and found an ad offering $10 an hour for basic house cleaning. The ad included pictures of a normal middle-class suburban home in the next town over. Jessica emailed the poster, explicitly stating she was only 15. Within minutes, a man replied. He offered to personally pick her up and drop her off every day, claiming his office was nearby. Eager to work, Jessica agreed and gave him her home address. The following Monday morning, a black Nissan Maxima pulled up to her house. The driver, who introduced himself as James, was a man in his late 30s with a thick black beard. He didn't look like he was dressed for an office job, but Jessica ignored her intuition. James drove her to his house, unlocked the front door, handed her a spare key, and immediately left, telling her to just straighten things up. Jessica found it incredibly strange that a grown man would leave a teenager he had just met entirely alone in his house. The house wasn't even dirty. All she had to do was run a vacuum and fold a few towels. The only unbearable part was the heat. It was over 90 degrees outside, and all the windows in the house were painted shut. When James returned 6 hours later to pay her and drive her home, Jessica asked if she could turn the AC on the next day. James looked at her through the rearview mirror and said with a completely straight face, "The AC is broken. If you get hot, just take your clothes off." Jessica nervously laughed it off, but she felt sick to her stomach. Despite the extreme discomfort, she returned the next few days for the money. On Thursday, the temperature inside the house reached over 100 degrees. Jessica was sweating profusely, trying to clean the upstairs hallway. Then, James came home early. He said he had taken the rest of the day off to help her clean. Jessica was terrified. He followed her closely from room to room, never speaking, just watching her sweat. Desperate for a moment of privacy, she excused herself and locked herself inside the upstairs master bathroom. As she splashed cold water on her face, she noticed something odd near the ceiling molding. Tucked deep into the corner, blending in with the paint, was a tiny black camera lens pointing directly at the shower. Her heart began to race. She dropped to her knees and checked under the bathroom sink. Hidden behind a stack of towels were 2 tall stacks of VHS tapes and a digital recording deck. Every single tape had a bright yellow sticky note on it with a girl's name. The tape sitting on the very top of the stack had Jessica's name on it. Before she could process the horror, James knocked loudly on the bathroom door. "Are you almost done in there?" he asked, his voice low. Jessica lied, claiming she felt violently ill and needed to go home immediately. James surprisingly agreed to drive her, but as soon as they got into his car, the atmosphere changed. He didn't speak, and when he pulled out of his neighborhood, he turned left instead of right. He was driving in the complete opposite direction of Jessica's house, heading toward the highway. "Where are we going?" Jessica asked, her voice shaking. James didn't look at her. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What were you looking at in the bathroom?" he demanded, his voice dropping to an angry growl. Jessica didn't answer. They approached a red light at a busy intersection. The moment the car slowed down, Jessica unlocked the door, threw it open, and threw herself out into the street. She scrambled to her feet and ran into a crowded gas station, hiding in the back aisle while she called her mother in hysterics. Her mother called the police, who raided James's house that afternoon. They found the cameras and the tapes. James was arrested on multiple severe federal charges. The most chilling detail of the investigation was that the police asked Jessica to look at a lineup of photos to identify some of the other girls whose names were on those tapes. Several of those girls had been reported missing for months. Buying used furniture online is a common practice for college students. When David and his roommate found a pristine black leather couch on Craigslist for only $200, it seemed like an absolute steal. David emailed the seller and arranged to pick it up that evening. Unfortunately, his roommate got called into work for a double shift, meaning David had to drive out to the location alone in his pickup truck. The address provided was far outside the city limits. David drove for 40 minutes until the paved road turned into a narrow, unlit dirt path surrounded by dense, towering pine trees. At the end of the path sat a small, isolated wooden cabin that looked completely dilapidated. There were no lights on inside. David parked his truck, leaving the headlights shining on the front door. He walked up the rotting wooden steps and knocked loudly 3 times. No one answered. But from inside the house, David heard the distinct sound of heavy floorboards creaking. Someone was walking toward the door, but they were deliberately tiptoeing. A muffled, raspy voice spoke from behind the solid wood door. "Are you the guy for the couch?" "Yeah, I have the cash," David replied, feeling a sudden chill in the air. "Okay," the voice said, sounding rushed and breathless. "Come around to the back of the house. The couch is on the back porch." David hesitated. His gut screamed at him to leave, but he had driven all this way. He slowly walked off the front porch and made his way around the side of the dark cabin, using the flashlight on his phone to guide him through the tall grass. When he turned the corner to the backyard, there was no couch. There was no porch. Instead, in the middle of a small clearing surrounded by trees, stood 4 incredibly tall men. They were all wearing long, dark, heavy robes. They stood in a perfect circle, their hands clasped together in front of them, heads bowed in total silence. In the center of their circle was a large, deep hole dug into the dirt, covered by a heavy metal grate secured with a thick steel chain. David stopped breathing. He took 1 step backward, stepping on a dry twig. It snapped with a loud crack. All 4 men slowly raised their heads and looked directly at him in the darkness. Then, the same raspy voice David had heard from behind the front door spoke from the shadows near the house. "Where is your friend?" The seller knew David was supposed to have his roommate with him. David didn't wait to find out why. He spun around and sprinted as fast as he could toward his truck. He practically dove into the driver's seat, frantically shoving the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, he looked in the side mirror. The front door of the cabin had flown wide open, and the men in robes were pouring out onto the front lawn, sprinting toward his truck. David slammed the truck into gear and tore out of the dirt driveway, his tires kicking up mud and rocks. He didn't stop driving until he reached the bright lights of the city. He reported the address to the police, but the property was technically abandoned woodland. David still checks his locks every night, terrified by the fact that the men in the woods knew exactly how many people were supposed to be in that truck. When you are just 12 years old, the internet can be a very deceptive place. Chloe and her older sister were looking for cheap plastic storage bins for their craft supplies. They found a listing on Craigslist offering a massive storage tote for just $10. Chloe's sister emailed the seller, and they agreed to meet at a local dollar store parking lot at 9 p.m. Since it was just a few blocks away, Chloe's sister, who had to work the night shift, told Chloe she could walk there alone with her little red pull wagon to collect the tote. At 8:45 p.m., Chloe walked alone down the dark suburban sidewalks to the empty dollar store parking lot. A beat-up, rusted 2006 Kia pulled into the lot. A heavy-set, older man stepped out. He didn't have the plastic tote. "Hey," the man said, looking around the empty lot, "I forgot the bin at my house. If you hop in, we can go grab it real quick. I'll even give it to you for free." Chloe, remembering her parents' warnings about stranger danger, firmly said no and turned around to walk away. As she walked, the man called out from behind her, "Hey, little girl, you live at 234 Maple Road, right? Apartment 3B? Chloe's blood ran cold. She had never given him her address, only her sister had emailed him, and she hadn't given him the address either. The man had somehow tracked their IP address or email to their physical location. Chloe dropped her wagon and sprinted all the way home, tears streaming down her face. She lived on the 3rd floor of an older apartment building. She ran up the stairs, locked her front door, deadbolted it, and pulled all the blinds shut. She sat in the dark living room, shaking uncontrollably. An hour passed. The building was dead silent. Then she heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of large boots slowly climbing the wooden stairs of the apartment complex. The footsteps stopped directly outside her door. "Hey!" A deep, familiar voice whispered through the wood. "I brought the tote. Come open the door and help me carry it." Chloe slapped a hand over her mouth to muffle her crying. She crawled to the door and looked through the peephole. The man from the parking lot was standing right outside, his back to the door, looking up and down the empty hallway. When she didn't answer, the doorknob began to rattle violently. Then, the man took a step back and launched his heavy boot directly into the door, right near the lock. Bang! The wood splintered. Chloe scrambled away from the door and hid underneath the kitchen sink, pulling the cabinet doors shut, clutching an old wooden broom handle like a weapon. Bang! The man kicked the door a second time, snapping the deadbolt out of the doorframe. The door swung open, hitting the wall. Heavy boots stepped into the apartment. Suddenly, a loud, angry voice echoed from the hallway. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The violent kicking had woken up the neighbor across the hall, a large man who had grabbed his aluminum baseball bat. Before the intruder could find Chloe, the neighbor swung the bat, striking the heavy-set man squarely in the jaw. The intruder collapsed in the doorway. Chloe burst out of the cabinet, ran past the bleeding man on the floor, and fled down the stairs, running all the way to the hospital where her sister worked. She collapsed in the lobby, hyperventilating. The police arrived at the apartment and arrested the unconscious man. During the investigation, it was revealed that the man wasn't just a scammer. He was a violent repeat offender with a long history of stalking. He had used the fake Craigslist ad specifically to lure someone out of their house, tracking their digital footprint to find out where they lived.